So, Peter, I was just wondering if you'd explain to start with what a SPAD actually is.
Yeah, so a special advisor is someone who advises and acts as a friend and a sounding board really for a cabinet minister. Every cabinet minister has at least one or two special advisors. Some cabinet ministers, especially in senior positions, have more. The Chancellor, for example, has about 10, and the Prime Minister has about 40. And but most cabinet secretaries, such as, for example, the Housing Secretary or the Education Secretary, will have two, and they'll generally be a policy special advisor or a media special advisor. And special advisors are usually members of the governing political party. They are not impartial, they are political. So you have sometimes in government departments, you have hundreds or thousands or even tens of thousands of civil servants. And their job is to implement the policies that the government has been elected on. But nonetheless, they are people who are impartial. So Keir Starmer wins in 2024, for example, all those civil servants can continue. But obviously, as the cabinet ministers would then leave their posts, their special advisors would too. So I was a special advisor for 3.5 years in four different government departments for four different cabinet ministers. And yeah, that's what I did. And it was a really enjoyable time.
Yeah, would you say what's the key difference between a media SPAD and a policy SPAD? Is a media SPAD maybe going to end up firefighting more for the media, policy SPAD more long term?
Yeah, probably. I mean, there's definitely a lot of firefighting for policy special advisors as well. Policy special advisors, the question, I suppose, is how does this benefit the minister politically? So one special advisor at the Ministry of Defence once told me, my job is not tanks, my job is politics. So you have enough people who know about tanks in the Ministry of Defence, but you may not have that many people who know about politics. So the question is, can this policy get through in this case, in terms of the government at the moment, the Conservative Party, will the backbenchers like it? Special advisors often talk through things like policies, for example, with backbenchers or with more junior members of the party to say, we should do this and here's why, essentially. So a lot of party management is part of it as well. But in terms of policy advisors, yes, their job is to be across the detail of what's happening and look for any pitfalls as well. Whereas the media special advisor, which is the job I did, was much more about talking to journalists and making sure that the minister's agenda is advanced through the media and advising ministers on which appearances to do and so on.
I was going to say, do you think it's a good career? Well, career may be in inverted commas, since you said the average life of a SPAD is 2 years. You lasted 3.5 years. How do you get to be a SPAD if you're a sixth form student, say, or do politics at university?
It's not really a career, it's a job rather than a career. It doesn't last very long. I changed my job 3 times during the time I was a special advisor. Some people last a very, very short period of time. I've known people who've lasted a couple of months. But usually the average length of time is usually about 2 years. So how do you become a special advisor? Well, there's no particular route. A lot of people will certainly study politics at university, but there are, that's not necessarily a requirement. There's no job description necessarily. I know people who've done business degrees. I know people who've been teachers beforehand. I know people who've been in business or in politics themselves. Maybe they've worked as a researcher for an MP. A lot of people, when they come out of university, some people even in their gap years, actually, if they have a gap year, or in sort of sandwich years. I'm sure you and many of your students will be familiar with some of the courses in the UK where you actually work for an MP, usually as a sort of paid intern for a year as part of your degree. And of course, those jobs as researchers are advertised usually, and it's there are some special advisors, not lots, but some who've become researchers and then kind of work their way up, and then their minister has perhaps become a cabinet secretary. So Matt Hancock, for example, his special advisor, Alan Nixon, who's a good friend of mine, is someone who was his researcher and then became a special advisor. So that's one way in. Another way is to work for the party itself, whether that's at Labour headquarters or Conservative headquarters. There are there's the Conservative Research Department, for example, where a lot of special advisors will start their career or maybe their second job, where they're working on particular bits of policy, working with special advisors perhaps. The special advisor is quite a senior job, and usually people will have done a few jobs before they do that, although some people do get in very, very young. It just depends enormously, and it's to do often with your relationship with the minister. Can they trust you? Are they someone who they would seek advice for? I mean, there are a lot of people around who can hypothetically do the job, and it's really a lot of it is to do with personal connection. Although saying that, I was the first job I did for James Brokenshire when he was in the Northern Ireland office. I didn't know him at all, and he sort of hired me, not knowing me. I mean, we'd met for an interview, but it's a very, you know, it's not like being a nurse or something like that where you know there's a very clear career trajectory. So, but I always said anybody who wants to get into politics, you know, do it. It's really, you know, it won't be boring. And a lot of the jobs that perhaps the people who are watching this can apply for and do straight after university or soon after that are really interesting, rewarding jobs. You're not going to make a fortune. You'll make more if you become an investment banker, but it'll be much more interesting, and you'll probably make much more of a difference as well.
So as a media spad, when you're setting up interviews for your minister, who do you fear the most? The Today programme? Good Morning Britain? The Today programme? Good Morning Britain?
I mean, Piers Morgan certainly is someone who we didn't do for a while, and the government boycotted Good Morning Britain for a while. And I suppose the question is that actually an interview, or is it just being harangued? Really, you know, is there a chance to get your points across? Really, rather than just being criticised the whole time. So it's interesting to me that I used to work in Good Morning Britain. I was a journalist for 10 years before I was a special advisor. So I know it sort of from both sides, and I work with Piers, and I know him sort of very well. So yes, it's a funny old thing. I think that the one journalist that we fear is the wrong word, but certainly respected because she's so forensic, is Emma Barnett, who used to be on Five Live. She presents on Newsnight once a week, and now she's on Women's Hour actually. But certainly, if you're on Five Live against Emma Barnett, you would do your homework beforehand. But similarly, you know, there's some interviewers who you may not think are particularly brilliant interviewers, but every now and again they can just ask a question that just comes out of nowhere. I mean, I think about a week 10 days ago, an interviewer on Sky News, Sam Coates, who is okay, but I never really thought he's a brilliant TV interviewer, asked Boris Johnson whether he thought that it was okay to be woke, and Boris Johnson just completely panicked and didn't quite know how to answer it. And you know, it caused a sort of a brief kind of media furore. So questions can come from anywhere, and also cabinet ministers need to know really everything from, you know, sometimes you get the quantity questions, but you sometimes can't possibly know. You know, how many, ask the education secretary who is responsible for the care system, how many children are in the care system? Well, it changes every day. So you don't know. You're responsible for the care system, but you don't know how many children are in it. Well, it's probably around 80,000, but I don't know exactly because it changes every day. So you don't know. You know, so it can go that way, kind of thing, and create stories that are sometimes very distracting and away from the government's agenda.
Do you think it's democratic to boycott certain programs? No program has a right to interview anybody. I think it would be very weird if the government didn't do any interviews, but I would be astonished if there's anybody who says, there might be people who say, okay, well, why didn't the government do Good Morning Britain for, you know, a period of, I think, 7 or 8 months? But my answer to that is it's entirely the government's prerogative to do whatever they want in terms of interviews. Piers Morgan's not elected. Nobody in television is elected, and that's, you know, the media is obviously part of our democracy. But if ministers are doing interviews in lots of other places, if they're being held to account and they're being held to, you know, they're being scrutinised as they are every day through the press, through the broadcast media, and in Parliament, well, that's okay. Essentially, I mean, I don't know of anybody who says they're sort of not informed about what the government is doing because they won't do one particular interview. And also, you know, I don't think any interviewer has a God-given right to interview anybody, really. And I think it's, you know, the job of special advisors, the job of the government sort of media people is to present the government in the best light. And what was really interesting was, I mean, I would occasionally get journalists ring me and say, no, you didn't, I was speaking to you last week and you didn't tell me this thing that is now a big story. And my answer was always the same. I don't work for you. I work for my minister. I'm not
I am not someone who does what you tell me to do. I do what my minister tells me to do and what is in the best interest of my minister. So if what is in the best interest of my minister isn't to do a particular interview, well, that's the way it is. And people can, scream and shout and throw their toys out of the pram, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really amount to very much. And also, I don't think too many people really get that head up about it. I mean, you can always turn over to another program and see them on that.
Yeah. Can I just I'll just pause because I just have to put my battery charger in actually.
Okay, yeah,
Just
no problem. No
Sorry,
problem.
just 30
That's
seconds.
okay.
They're done. Edit that bit out.
Okay, no worries.
And so I was going to also ask you about Dominic Cummings. You describe him as a strategic genius in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe would you say he's good at and brilliant at campaigning, having won various campaigns, particularly Brexit. But maybe in government, does it require a different skill set to be a special advisor? And do you think that someone like him sort of proroguing Parliament as sort of partly trashing an unwritten constitution, which is quite delicate and quite precious in some ways, and people have to act according to precedent?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think?
Yes, well, I mean, to take the last bit of your question first, the proroguing Parliament, I mean, the point is, I suppose, that whether you agree or disagree with that, the Supreme Court ruled against it and Parliament came back. And that's the power of the scrutiny bodies. The Supreme Court said that it wasn't legal, so therefore Parliament came back immediately. Therefore, they obeyed the rule of law in that regard. So, you can have an argument about whether it was right to prorogue in the first place or not. And my point would be, the government did what it was told when the legal case was brought. It didn't resist the Supreme Court. Therefore, the system in that regard works, in my opinion.
What about failing to appear before the DCMS committee, which is a form of contempt of Parliament, isn't it?
They ruled it was contempt of Parliament. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and defend every single thing that Dominic Cummings did, because I don't agree with a lot of it. I would personally, I think it's unlikely I'll ever be called before a select committee, but if I was called before a select committee, I would go. I think Dominic has shown that he has a lot of contempt for Parliament, for Conservative MPs, sometimes for the democratic process, but that's, he doesn't care. And that's the way he operated, and operated very successfully for a long period of time.
Isn't that more successful for a campaign, though, than running a government, for a span of time, like 4 or 5 years?
I think he's a very, very successful campaigner, as you correctly say. If you look at the radicals who've really, in the last if you look at the Conservatives being in government for the last 11 years, the radicals who have been in it haven't really lasted very long. Steve Hilton, for example, who's one of Cameron's people, lasted, I think, just over 2 years. Nick Timothy obviously was at the Home Office for quite a long time, but when he got to Downing Street, he only lasted a year, and Dominic Cummings lasted less than 18 months. But what I would say about Dominic is that, the free schools, for example, which of course we have in Hammersmith, is a huge legacy of Dominic Cummings. He was someone who really believed in those. He was the special advisor at the education department with Michael Gove, who's obviously was hated by many teachers. But the point is, he drove through huge reform. And Dominic, in his 18 months, Brexit would not have happened in the way that it happened. It probably would not have actually happened, I would argue, without him. And that's, I voted Remain, but nonetheless, Dominic wanted that to happen, and the government was elected on the slogan of "Get Brexit Done," and that's exactly what he made happen. Also, the election itself, again, very much in terms of the campaigning aspect of things. So those were sort of two big campaign victories, but also the implementation of Brexit, and also civil service reform, which I think wasn't hugely. He'd only really started it, but to take on the civil service and to get rid of so many permanent secretaries, rightly or wrongly, is something that a lot of people would like to do. So if you think of the 18 months that Dominic Cummings was in Downing Street, there were sort of three things: Brexit, the election, and the beginnings of civil service reform. I mean, most secretaries of state and most politicians would kill to have three very tangible things that were achieved within their time. I mean, there's so many secretaries of state who are in government departments for longer than that, and nobody can ever remember what they do or what sort of the point of them was, really. So I think it's really quite impressive in many ways.
Isn't that a democratic problem, though, in a sense? Because as the Prime Minister's senior advisor, he has an awful lot of power, isn't he? He's unelected and unaccountable in a sense. And quite a lot of Spads have huge influence, like Nick Timothy, Fiona Hill, of course, and Ed Balls when he was at the Treasury. Yeah. He was relatively young, younger than you, and yet he had vast amount of power, didn't he, at the Treasury? And isn't that a sort of democratic problem in terms of accountability?
Well, I suppose the question is, how much democracy do you want? I mean, you look at President Biden, for example. He's the only person in his administration who, apart from Kamala Harris, who's actually elected, whereas they will appoint probably 8,000 or 9,000 people who work for them or are politically appointed employees. In the UK, we have something like 115 special advisors, I think, at the moment, or 115 people who are employed as them, and some are part-time. So I suppose the question is, how much democracy do you want in terms, do we want to start electing, bin men or, rat catchers in the way they sometimes do in America? There are lots of people who have lots of influence in our society. Senior civil servants aren't elected. Teachers aren't elected, and they have huge influence on their students, for example. So a lot of people who run a lot of things, and very, very influential things. Universities, for example, would be another example. But all sorts of institutions, most people aren't elected. So you can say it's the government of your country and all the rest of it, but Dominic Cummings' power on every special advisor's power flows directly from, and there's a direct line between them and the person who is elected, and that's actually a lot more accountability than most people have in their daily lives, I would argue.
I mean, if he was a minister, he'd break the ministerial code, wouldn't he, with his trip to Barnard Castle? So there's like one code for ministers and almost another special.
Well, I mean, I personally think he was the only special advisor who could have survived that. Many who didn't. So it's a question of how much political capital the Prime Minister, Priti Patel is another example, who the independent advisor on the ministerial code said she broke the ministerial code, and the Prime Minister decided to disregard that advice and keep Priti Patel where she is, and that's at the Home Office, and he expended a lot of political capital doing that. And it's really interesting. People are, we're sitting here on the 1st of February, and people are talking about the reshuffle that may well come after I think it will come after the local elections, and people are saying, oh, well, they have to reshuffle Priti Patel. Well, no, he doesn't have to. He doesn't have to do anything. She may well stay in that post, and she's been called a bully by an independent inquiry. Yet Boris Johnson has decided to keep her in that post, and that's the prerogative of the Prime Minister. So the ministerial code is only as good as how it's implemented. So even if Dominic Cummings was subject to it, for example, that's he may not have been. The Prime Minister clearly stood behind him after Barnard Castle. Although I would argue that was not so much the beginning of the end as the end, and it was only a matter of time before he had to go.
Why do you think there are more special advisors? I mean, before 1964 and Wilson, there weren't really many, although in your book you do detail some, in Lloyd George's case and Winston Churchill. There's been a big growth of specialised advisors. I mean, is it partly because of the 24-hour news cycle?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's also natural that a lot of these ministries look to America, look to Canada, for example, where every minister has at least 15 special advisors, and obviously in America, thousands of people who are advising you. So there are many examples. In France, there are a lot more as well. So there are lots of international examples. In the UK, we actually have very few in comparison to other countries. So I think it's inevitable that will grow. Although they did kind of, as I say in the book, sort of waxed and waned over the years. Michael Portillo actually interviewed me about the book, and he said when he was a special advisor, there were only 7 in Downing Street. So, and now it's sort of more like 40-45. So it does wax and wane as time goes on, but certainly they've got to an unprecedented level under Tony Blair, and there are now more special advisors than ever. So that's certainly have grown, as you say.
Do you think that, sort of related to this, that the quality of cabinet discussions is maybe affected somewhat by the number of leaks that occurred? And I don't know, you mentioned in your book that you would know one or two ministers or special advisors that might leak a bit. I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it? In the May cabinet, within an hour or so, almost the details of the cabinet meeting were out. And certainly in the Sunday Times, Tim Shipman seems to have a pretty good account of what went on in cabinet. I mean, does that reduce cabinet collective responsibility, or does it affect the quality of cabinet government, would you say?
Oh, completely. And I think it's outrageous that people leak from cabinet. Everybody has an agenda in politics and often in life. So I think there's a really, certainly in the May administration, there was one minister who advocated to me that just the whole thing was live on Sky News. But certainly what it got to a stage where people were saying things because they wanted them to be leaked and wanted to be seen to be tough on things like Brexit, and they knew their words would be out, and people weren't saying things that they should have said because of the lack of confidentiality. And what's really interesting is, when I was a journalist, a lot of what I said was, transparency all the way and freedom of information and all the rest of it. But having been on the inside, sometimes you need to not see how, the old joke about never see how laws and sausages are made. And sometimes you just need a bit of quiet and a bit of confidentiality to work through the issues with people, so that everybody doesn't kind of pile in and give their 2 cents. So I think it's a bit better under the Boris Johnson administration, but certainly there are still, there are cabinet ministers who leak.
Would you say the cabinet sort of been weakened by excluding a lot of talented and experienced ministers that wouldn't sign up to the no-deal Brexit? I mean, people like, I suppose, Jeremy Hunt, David Gauke, Greg Clark, Dominic Grieve, all pretty competent, all experienced. And so in a sense, what Dominic Cummings and Johnson have done is removed a large part of the gene pool and a lot of experience from the cabinet. So we end up with a cabinet that's less impressive than previous cabinets.
I mean, I think that's a matter of opinion, really. I mean, certainly it was brutal to say to people like, Philip Hammond, for example, or sorry?
Nick Soames?
Yeah, a lot of people, Nicholas Soames, for example. I mean, huge, obviously familial links to the Conservative Party, but it was definitely brutal to say, you disagree with the policy, therefore you're going. But at the same time, perhaps that brutality was needed because you went into an election in 2019 where everybody was signed up to the government's policy. And that's something that wasn't going to happen where those people standing as Conservatives. And I think, unity is a really difficult thing. Every political party is some form of coalition, certainly. And you're saying you get rid of a lot of experience and talent, and certainly have a lot of time for a lot of those people. David Gauke, for example, I think was an excellent Justice Secretary. But it's really interesting how I think every cabinet, everybody always says, all the time, every cabinet's worse than the last one, or where are these political big beasts like, Michael Heseltine and, sort of people in the past. Always seem better. I mean, every cabinet, like every party's coalition, every cabinet's coalition. And I think that, you will have people who are better and worse, and it reflects the political reality of the day, and it reflects the Prime Minister's power. What's really interesting, and I would say to your students actually, to look at the next reshuffle will say a lot about the power of Boris Johnson, and certainly after the local elections, which I'm pretty convinced the Conservatives will do quite badly in. So I don't, for example, here in London, or where you are in London, I don't think Sean Healy is going to be elected at all. And I think Andy Street in the West Midlands is quite vulnerable. So you could certainly get to a situation where Boris Johnson is having to give jobs to people to shore up his own position, but within that makes himself weaker. And the litmus test of that, I think, is actually Jake Berry, who, despite being a very close personal friend of the Prime Minister, they have breakfast every now and again. He was heavily involved in his leadership campaign. I think if Jake gets into the cabinet, for example, it will show how weak Boris Johnson is, because Jake is the leader of this NRG group, the Northern Research Group, sort of Northern Powerhouse, Red Wall kind of grouping. And if he gets into the cabinet, I think it will show how weak Boris Johnson is. So it really reflects a lot of things, and it's not just as simple as that, I think.
Why do you say Keir Starmer isn't further ahead, really? Because he seems to win a lot of the time at question time, comes across as much more prime ministerial. I mean, do you think that it's partly because of, is it called loyalty to the flag in a time of crisis?
No, I think it's because Keir Starmer is absolutely useless. I mean, William Hague, for example, won against Tony Blair loads of times the Prime Minister's Questions. People don't watch Prime Minister's Questions, people don't see it. You know, there are people in Westminster who don't watch it because it's kind of a waste of time. You know, Keir Starmer has been really bad. I mean, he's really managed the almost impossible task of making Ed Miliband look good. I mean, even Jeremy Corbyn believed something, even though it was, you know, things that would have destroyed our country. But it's really interesting how Keir Starmer has really not connected with people. I was worried at the start. I thought I wrote an article actually for Times Red Box, sort of saying that you know, we need to watch him, and we need to find out how to beat him as Conservatives. And I'm still a member of the Conservative Party, I still feel loyal to the government. But he's just been nowhere. I mean, what Labour appear to do is call for things that are already being in train, or the government says, right, we're going to announce something at 5 o'clock, and they come out at 2 o'clock and say, you must do this. If you walk down, you know, King Street in Hammersmith and ask 10 people to name one thing that Keir Starmer actually believes, I'm not sure they could tell you. They could certainly tell you what Boris Johnson believes. They may not agree with it, but they could certainly tell you what he believes. But I think opposition in this country is pretty dreadful. And, you know, I want a healthy opposition, but the big hitters just aren't there. You don't have the vet keepers, you know, even people like Ed Balls, who I think is not outside the realms of possibility. He makes a comeback into politics. Really kind of very good, you know, Labour opposing figures. People like Stella Creasy, for example, I think is a really good Labour MP, really good at opposing and just kind of hacking away at the policies of the Conservative government and providing proper opposition. But I just think Keir Starmer's a dud. I can't see him becoming Prime Minister in 2024. I can't see a coalition happening. Maybe it needs to be the SNP or something, but I just don't see Labour winning outright, and they just don't have a lot of, you know, I just don't think they're pretty good people on the front bench. Like David Lammy, for example, is rubbish. At Justice, which is an area I know very well. Louise Hay is quite good actually in Northern Ireland. She's quite a good person and seems to land a few blows. But I mean, we'll see a major Labour front bench reshuffle when it comes up in 2024. You'll see some of these people who are in perhaps cushier numbers at the moment, you know, chairing select committees and things like that, who will come to the fore, and you know, they'll get better. But I think people just haven't connected with Keir Starmer, partially perhaps because of coronavirus and the fact that you know, a lot of that transcends party politics. But there's a lot to hold the government to account for in coronavirus, and a lot of mistakes that they have, you know, quite clearly made. I think Labour have really failed to capitalise on that politically, and you know, they need to do that. They need to make many more inroads if they're going to be successful in 2024. Which obviously I hope they're not, but I'm just trying to sort of see it from a wider perspective.
Coming back to the style of government, would you say that because of the smaller majority, and personality maybe, that Theresa May there was much more emphasis on cabinet government, whereas Boris Johnson is really presidential in style?
I think
focused on the Prime Minister. Yeah,
maybe. I think coronavirus has obviously made us a lot more focused on Boris Johnson. I wouldn't say it's presidential necessarily in style, certainly the way that Tony Blair or even David Cameron was actually. It's interesting with Theresa May, obviously, she had to be much more conciliatory. Obviously, she had a very small majority and then no majority. So, you know, that's a very tricky situation, extremely tricky situation to be in. Certainly when I was on the inside, it was very, very difficult, as I outlined in the book. And it was, you know, I think Boris is very lucky, as any politician is, to have a huge majority. And of course, there have been rebellions already, and he's, you know, almost lost his majority a couple of times. So it's never, just because you have an 80 strong majority doesn't necessarily mean you're immune from things. So he's had his own problems that way.
And would you say there's too much churn? I mean, you worked for, is it 3 or 4 cabinet ministers?
Or
Yeah. And what in several ministries, Northern Ireland, Home Office, and housing, yeah, and justice, yeah, and so there's a lot of churn for you, and there's a big turnover. And I think in the book you mentioned that big turnover, certainly of ministers. Have there been 4 housing ministers in a year nearly, or something like that?
I don't think it's just quite in a year, but I think it's been something like 10 in 10 years or 11. Labour was similar, by the way. But no, certainly there are very few ministers who get a really good chance to just make a huge difference. And the short-termism is very tricky. David Cameron tried to appoint people almost the whole time, and that was probably quite a good idea.
Was that effective? Yeah,
you've got to get it right, which is, otherwise you're sort of lumbered with people. But no, it is, the short-termism is very, very difficult. But politics is short-term, and even in 5 years between elections, or in the last 10 years when we've had 5 elections, it's been very, very, the short-termism is a huge problem. But that's kind of where the civil service comes in that it's a more permanent aspect of things.
And do you think the tone has changed now that Dominic Cummings has gone?
Oh, absolutely.
With Allegra Stratton, no over-promising and a bit more cautious?
I think it's really been since the new year that Dominic and Lee Kane, the communications director, going was a huge change and shift, and obviously Dan Rosenfield has taken over as the chief of staff. I think there's a very noticeable change. I think Boris is a lot more cautious now, I think, in terms of what he is saying and how he's saying it, and he's naturally a very ambitious, obviously ambitious, but optimistic person. And I think it's that there's a more kind of let's wait and see, which is much better, because far better to be really clear in terms of what could happen. And I think certainly in terms of coronavirus, we need to realise that the government is not in control. The virus is in control. The virus is dictating what things happen. You've got to be honest with the public, and a lot of people, especially on the left, look to government to solve all problems. And I think being realistic and saying that government can't solve all problems, it's impossible in everyone's life. And obviously I'm a conservative, believe in personal responsibility, but certainly in regard to coronavirus, there's a lot of personal responsibility, but also Boris is governing in a very unconservative way in many ways.
Yes, true.
The amount of money that's being spent, the intrusion into people's lives, telling people to stay at home, for example, is some would argue, well, some anti-lockdown people have argued is fascistic. I personally don't think so. I think it's the way we're going to get rid of the virus, as well as vaccination.
In a sense, would Theresa May be much more precautionary and take more notice of SAGE? In a sense, we've got the wrong Prime Minister at the wrong time.
A few people said that.
May would be more precautionary and not overstating what was going to happen. Over-promising, for example. Mistakes.
I think that's probably not a bad point, but at the same time, you've got to deal with the reality you're in. And I think there are enough people around Boris Johnson who are cooler, maybe slightly cooler heads, who are a bit more pragmatic and sticking to that as well. Certainly, you look at the huge popularity of people like Chris Whitty, for example, who's very much, especially actually Jonathan Van Tam as well, who are very much in control of this as well.
Yeah. Okay. And so your end really was unfortunately after. Why do you think Dominic Cummings, or was it Dominic Cummings that sort of sacked you in the end? And were you perceived as too Mayite, or were you perceived as a Remainer, or what? Or was it I don't
really particularly sat around thinking too much about me, to be honest. I'm not kind of arrogant enough to say that Dominic Cummings was going to stroking his chin and saying what should we do with Peter. But there were certainly there's a lot of SPAD turnover. As I say, I lasted 3.5 years. There were I got a sort of a bonus of 6 months at the Ministry of Justice, which I didn't expect to get. I was there for almost all of the May administration. My main person I worked for, James Churn, was sacked. I thought I'd be sacked too. And then I was sort of given a call and asked to work at the Ministry of Justice for 6 months, which I did. And it wasn't a huge shock to kind of be called in and told that, you know, it was over really those sort of slightly chilling words, the Prime Minister no longer has confidence in your ability to do your job, which made me think, well, at some stage the Prime Minister perhaps did have confidence in me to do my job, which I hadn't previously considered. But no, it's brutal. And actually, I've been in touch with Lee Kane, who was the person who delivered those words on Dominic's sign-off since he left government. And you know, it was interesting when Dominic and Lee left government, a number of people were contacting me and saying, oh, you know, you must feel really good about this. And I said, well, I don't. You know, they have families and mortgages and you know, a life, and it's a really difficult job, and you know, you've got to do it as well as you can, and it's easy to, I think, with politics in general and politicians in general, it's easy to see it as part of the soap opera, but there's always, or you know, chess pieces on a board around Westminster, but there's always a human story behind there. There's always a family. There's always an income that you need to worry about. So you do, you know, I see politicians far more now than I ever did as people who have lives and thoughts and feelings. And I think that we all need to remember that, certainly when we're being, you know, very brutally critical about people.
At least it wasn't as brutal as what happened to Sonia Khan.
That's right. Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
And would you say your consumption of Diet Coke's gone down?
a little bit, but I'm actually at home in Northern Ireland at the moment, and hence the lockdown haircut. And my parents have been regulating the Diet Coke intake.
What are you going to do now?
By
the way, I really enjoyed the book. The book was great.
Thank you. Thanks for
and yeah, reads very well, really fascinating.
Well, I should say to anyone who wants a copy, it's on Amazon, or you can send me a DM on Twitter if you want, at Peter Cardwell, if you want to get a signed copy. But what am I going to do now? I'm doing some media commentary stuff. I pop up in the media. I'm the director of a company to do with homelessness, which is something I did in the ministry, the policy area I covered in the Ministry of Housing. It's a commercial company, but it has a social aim. And I'm doing some consulting as well, so kind of explaining politics to businesses and helping them get their projects over the line. So it's not a million miles from what I did before, but it's a very different life. And of course, coronavirus kicked in after I left government, or just after. So a lot of what I've been doing has been on Zoom and so on. But it was a great life for 3.5 years. Really enjoyed it. Wouldn't rule out going back at some stage in the future. And I wish everybody in it, you know, very well. There's a lot of people who sort of say, oh, it was all fine when I was there, and it all sort of fell apart afterwards, kind of thing. You can't be one of those people.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for giving up your time. Okay.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you.